Welcome, Danny. We're all just taking a couple minutes to like, dislike, or pass statements on Polis. You can see the link on the chat. Welcome, Andrew. We're just taking a couple minutes to like, dislike, or pass comments on Polis.
Hey, everyone.
Hello. Hello, Warren. We're just taking a couple minutes to like, dislike, or pass statements on Polis. You can see the link here on the chat.
I found I was answering them too fast.
Okay, let's wait for one more minute. Okay, everyone, I'll invite you back to the room. And if you haven't finished, that's fine. For next week, let's try to make sure that we do that in advance of the workshop. And now I'll just give a quick overview of how this conversation went and what Polis is. So Polis is a tool that helps facilitate conversations at scale. And basically what it does is that it groups people into different opinion bubbles. So here in our group, we can see that we have 2 opinion bubbles, group A with 16 participants and group B with 7 participants. Let me just, sorry, I will actually refresh this to make sure that we really have the latest result. And this tool is actually used, has been used by millions of citizens in Taiwan, and it's super effective at fighting polarization and helping people find consensus. So let's see what we got for our group. 1 second. My report is loading. Okay.
While we're waiting, cool public service announcement. I just updated my Zoom and it now lets you rearrange where everybody's video on your screen is. So when you get that update, you get a little hand and you can rearrange. Super cool.
Can you see the report? Here, now you can see it, right?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So we have 2 opinion groups in our here. Group A with 17 participants, Group B with 13 participants. So let's see what Group A and Group B have agreed and disagreed on. Group A has agreed that institutions are society's best stab at date at wrangling with complexity. They are not perfect, but nor is anything we can come up with. Both new and old institutions are necessary for a legitimate and inclusive system. Close integration with existing legitimate institutions is crucial, so we get the idea. Group B is saying do not rely on existing institutions. We shall render obsolete legacy institutions by providing greater legitimacy with proof of personhood. Proof of personhood could eventually supplant traditional institutions because traditional institutions' identities are not internet native. So now let's look at where we have consensus or divisiveness. So here in this bar, we have dots, and the dots on the right show the most divisive statements. The ones on the left show the consensus statements. So we can see that we have a lot more consensus than disagreements. Most divisive statement is existing institutions should use proof of personhood protocols, but not the other way around. Do not rely on existing institutions. We should avoid existing institutions as much as possible. I think that's to be expected, and we probably have a lot of people over here who are probably living under governments who are not very respectful of democratic rights and human rights. So I think this is a result that was to be expected. And then let's see what we agree on. So existing institutions could use proof of personhood networks for direct cash transfers during disaster relief. Proof of personhood networks will influence existing institutions by showcasing cutting-edge governance and economic systems. We need to better understand the adversaries to proof of personhood and what are the motivations and methods to attack proof of personhood. Advocate for privacy-preserving approaches for civic engagement, educate officials about zero-knowledge methods, and work in partnership. All right, so I'm sure there are many other fascinating comments here. I will share with you the report. This was just a quick intro. Sorry, one second. I think Santi needs the Zoom link. Can someone send that to him, please?
Yeah, we gave it. No problem.
Okay, cool. And now let's just talk about what we have for today. We're having two talks by Professor Margaret Levi and Vitalik Buterin, and then we're just going to have an open discussion where you can ask them questions and we can debate some of the ideas that they will be presenting. So before we jump into this discussion, I just want to make a quick reminder that we have extraordinarily accomplished people in this room, but please let's just be aware that we're all just people, and we're here to talk about something that is extremely experimental and that involves a lot of uncertainty. So hopefully this won't be so much of a competition of who has the most clever ideas, but it can be more of a conversation where we are hearing each other and learning together. So if you are someone who usually speaks up more, I will actually ask you to allow others to contribute. And if you're someone who usually identify with listening more, I will ask you to speak up today. And hopefully we can just keep a spirit of intellectual humility as we go into this conversation. And now I will move on to introduce our first speaker for today. One of the reasons why I decided to invite Dr. Margaret Levi to be here with us is that proof of personhood networks usually are, they are these incredibly powerful protocols that enable new forms of political and economic coordination. But usually most of the people who are involved in these types of conversations are technologists, and we don't have a lot of opportunities to have cross-disciplinary discussions and collaborations. So this was one of my motivations behind inviting Dr. Margaret Levi to be here with us, Today, she will be speaking to us about some of the latest developments in the field of economics and the emerging science of self-governance. We're extremely lucky to have her. She needs no introduction, but I'll make a very short one, just as a formality. Professor Margaret Levi is the director of the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences and professor of political science at Stanford University. She's the recipient of the 2019 Johann Skytte Prize, which is known as the political science equivalent of the Nobel. And she has, among many other things, served as president of the American Political Science Association. Dr. Margaret Levi, thank you so much for being with us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And I start humbly here because as I told Paula, my knowledge of Ethereum, blockchain, all of those technologies is at the most rudimentary. I have some knowledge, but not a lot. I also, in doing that little survey, discovered something I suspected, which is that the ways in which we define terms are quite different sometimes. And so my understanding of some of those questions may not have been the same as yours. As Paula was talking about it, I don't think of institutions in the same way as many of you do. So I think of them as certain kinds of arrangements of rules and regulations and norms that structure our behavior, and they may or may not be big governments. So they can be all kinds of things. So that I will just to clarify that part of what I'm saying will probably be indecipherable to you, just as part of what you were saying was indecipherable to me. And that's part of why I think I'm here, is to help bridge that gap. So Paula asked me to talk about a book that I recently published with Federica Carregati, who's at King's College in London, called A New Moral or a Moral Political Economy, Past, Present, and Future. And that book comes out of a project that we're doing at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, infelicitously known as CASBIS. And it comes out of the same impulse, I think, that is inspiring many of you. We're recognizing that both capitalism and democracy, as they currently exist, are extremely frayed and are looking for alternative ways to structure the future and new kinds of institutional arrangements to do that. And our role really as academics is to help us think about that. How do we think about what constitutes a new political economic framework? All political economic frameworks throughout history have had a morality in them, but obviously we want one that reflects values that are held by many of us in this room today. And thinking about that problem ultimately makes us rethink markets and how to structure them, and to think about technology as a crucial piece of what that future looks like. So that's part of why I'm here to learn. Okay, so we start with a theory of change, which starts with the demonstrated failure of the status quo, but also involves creating new ideas, new ways of thinking about the problem, and a narrative that provides a vision of and a pathway to a better alternatives, that refines the issues in a way that overcomes pre-existing mental models and core beliefs and introduces an alternative perspective and suite of choices. So one of the key arguments in the book is that what we have is not natural, it is changeable. There have been lots of political economic frameworks over time, but that we get caught in a certain way of perceiving things. I think that's part of what Vitalik might mean by legitimacy, a set of ideas about what is right and appropriate and natural, and we want to change that. And we want ideas also, we're practical, so we want ideas that appeal to those with actual power in the system to actually affect change. That can be mobilized publics as well as governments, but we need to get to people's mental models to think that they can act on it and then produce some change. So mobilization is ultimately where we want to go. Our process is to recognize that our role in change is primarily in the realm of ideas that builds on the best work in social science and hopefully technology. And to establish a network of scholars, and thinkers, we have over 100 people involved in the network. And it's not exactly, if those of you who know about the Mont Pelerin Society, which gave birth to neoliberalism, but it's akin to that, with a hope that the ideas will emerge from this network. Even though we're focused on trying to produce them, you never know where the great ideas will come from. And we want to create the possibility for those to emerge anywhere. And then to disseminate those ideas. And that's part of what this little book is about. So there's certain themes that go throughout our argument. The first one is relational equality, and I think that really comes into play in thinking about proof of personhood in ways that are sort of recognized and could be better recognized. And this is a term that's closely associated with philosophers and political theorists, one of whom, Danielle Allen, has been involved with radical exchange. So relational equality is an important argument that we're emphasizing. And that's a state of affairs in which people treat each other with respect, listen to each other, and tolerate no domination of one by another. The achievement of relational equality requires that all have adequate resources so that they can develop capabilities, but also avoid the dependencies that produce unequal power relations and influence. And I think that really relates to the idea of proof of personhood. It also requires connectedness and all kinds of social interactions. And this leads to an effort on our part, not so much on yours, to develop a measure of flourishing and to move away from GDP as the metric for a well-functioning economy, which, as we know, GDP hides all kinds of inequalities, economic and political and social. The second big concept is an inclusive and expanded community of fate, F-A-T-E, fate, destiny, in which people recognize and act on their shared destinies. I developed this concept in a book with John Alquist called In the Interest of Others, in which we looked at some unions, some of which had developed this expanded and inclusive community of fate, and some of which had not. And the bottom line was that it was institutions, in the sense in which we mean institutions, that did the work. It was the governance arrangements, the kinds of norms that developed within the community, the participatory arrangements that led members to engage in costly actions on behalf of distant others who could never reciprocate. So these were unions who were set up to really act on narrow economic interests, but were able, in fact, to encourage their members and evoke from the membership a willingness to act in the interest of far distant others. So the creation of an inclusive and expanded community fate really depends on institutional arrangements that enable people not only to resist domination, but to develop their own bases of power and to engage in reciprocal and pro-social behavior. And we consider ways in which that idea can be scaled. I won't go into them here. Our three building blocks for the new political economy really involves a multidisciplinary enterprise. Our emphasis is on political economics, not just economics, and it's really political and social economics, and not just thinking about homo economicus, the narrow self-interested being, but really recognizing that humans are social beings. So we rely on psychology and cognitive science to clarify those alternatives and build arguments on these better premises, which means thinking about social infrastructure and institutions and interactions, and not just individualized agents. And that all leads to thinking about institutional redesign, which is, of course, what you all are worried about. Institutions, in our view, have to be trustworthy and legitimate. So those are two concepts which get used a lot. And I'm going to define them the way I define them, which isn't exactly the way all of you necessarily define them. So to be trustworthy means that people have confidence that the government or organizational leadership and other members others involved are upholding their side of the implicit social contract through promise keeping, which reflects both commitments to keep those promises, but also the capacity to actually fulfill the promises that are made. So throughout, we're really emphasizing capabilities and the development of capacities, and that's crucial to relational equality. It's crucial to an expanded community of fate, and it's crucial to trustworthiness. Trustworthiness of institutions and participants also means fairness of the process, given the norms of the place and time. So we've seen that change over eons. And finally, evidence that free riders and corrupt agents will be detected and punished. So that's what constitutes the trustworthiness of a set of relationships. Legitimacy rests on more than effective governance. It requires popularly acceptable justifications for who holds the reins of power, who the leadership is, and for the policies promoted. This includes, we hope, in the future, the promotion of relational equality. And here I'm really making a somewhat different argument than Vitalik's on legitimacy, though it's related. He's addressing what we generally call social conventions or norms in coordination games. So my notion of legitimacy, or the notion we're using, is one that is about a belief in what is right and moral in governance context, and often for collective action problems, which have a different process and a different problem than coordination games. So we want to expand this to collective action problems, not just coordination games. And so it's more than a social convention, which plays an important role in all kinds of things. So I really love that piece that Vitalik wrote, but I'm really thinking about political legitimacy and collective action problems, not just coordination games. Okay, so trustworthiness and legitimacy both rest on perceptions that vary among the population. So who is considered legitimate, who is considered, or what is considered trustworthy or legitimate, really depends on those who must credit that trustworthiness or legitimacy to a particular set of agents or actors. And that can vary immensely among the population, as we're seeing with the vaccine hesitancy and resistance movement. And it reflects histories, context, and information sources. And I would argue information is probably the least important part of it, because even though we give people facts, that doesn't necessarily change their mind. So we have to go deeper than that into the context in which people live and how they form their beliefs. So, okay, institutions then have to be trustworthy and legitimate, but they also have to promote and sustain relational equality. And this means that cooperation and self-governments work best when institutional arrangements allow members to collectively articulate and amend their governing rules and define and enforce them. And it means that capabilities have to be provided. I wrote a piece in a book that Brian Ford is also in, with John Seeley Brown and David Lee, that emphasized using expertise, but disseminating that expertise, not just having it held by the technologists who know how to do it, and not permitting a hierarchy of expertise. And again, I think that relates to proof of personhood. So institutions have to be participatory, they have to respect others, and require that respect and reward that respect. And I'm going to give a concrete example, which is really a thought experiment and is elaborated in the book and is really Federica. So I will do a bad job of explaining it, but I'll do what I can, which is the Council of Algorithms. Federica, my co-author, is actually an historian or a political theorist of ancient Greece. So this is really based on how the Greeks did it in a very participatory way. But this is a deliberative body in charge of decision-making where very simple organizational rules facilitated broad participation, knowledge aggregation, and citizen learning. So there'll be a few principles for this algorithmic council for governing algorithms. a participatory space for deliberation and debate to articulate the rules and establish enforcement mechanisms. As a permanent institution, it enables the type of institutional learning that is critical to amending the rules as circumstances, norms, and preferences change. Its members are randomly selected and in charge of decisions for a limited time, preventing the accumulation of power and fostering relational equality. By design, the counselors are asked to embody the interest of a community that goes well beyond the given group of decision makers, as their judgments will affect distant others, sometimes even in distant countries. Maybe this is where Vitalik's idea of legitimacy and ours overlap. And of course, by their very participation at the root of the decision-making process, the counselors have a chance to shape the decision-making process in ways that can help check the influence of powerful interests. So underlying this whole schema of a new moral political economy is an understanding of power and how to regulate it, an understanding of participation and spreading that power out in a variety of ways, and an understanding of the importance of inhibiting hierarchies and promoting relational equality. I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Margaret. I'm sure we all have many questions, but now we'll move on to Vitalik's presentation, and then we'll just have some time for a debate. I will now introduce Vitalik, who also, like Margaret, does not need any introduction. He's the creator of Ethereum, and he's one of the pioneers in the field of proof of personhood. He's also the creator or co-creator of quadratic funding, which is one of the ideas that has also really brought a lot of interest to and utility to proof of personhood networks. Vitalik, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So what I wanted to talk about today is a topic that's kind of adjacent to and I think relevant to proof of personhood projects. And this is coming from my perspective, kind of seeing how governance works, and particularly in crypto communities and various different kind of aspects of the Ethereum community, and just seeing like what I think is one of the biggest fundamental problems that these communities are facing, which is basically the problem of kind of how to measure who is a member and who is not a member. And even going beyond the binary and even thinking like to what extent is someone a member, and kind of why this matters, and going through and if in what cases their proof of personhood may actually turn out to be useful. The first kind of big question is who should participate in governance of public infrastructure in a community? And I think this question is harder, and I think people thinking about governance in a lot of ways can kind of put themselves on hard mode just by thinking about internet communities. The reason is that in internet communities, there's just so much more gradation and so much less kind of existing thought about how to formalize the concept of who is a member, who should be participating, who should not be participating. And we've even seen some incidents in the history of a lot of these networks where this question of who should be participating and who should not be participating actually does turn out to be quite important. Right. So one example of this was back when the DAO fork was happening. This was this controversial hard fork that the Ethereum protocol was doing back in 2016. There were a lot of people in favor of this protocol change, and there were a lot of people against that protocol change. And the public discussion ended up getting very heated. And one of the accusations that was sometimes made is that by the people who were in favor of the hard fork is that the people against it were actually people coming in from the Bitcoin community either trying to impose their Bitcoin community values on an ecosystem where people have somewhat different values, or just basically people without any alignment with the Ethereum community trying to cause trouble. And when Bitcoin itself had their own block size war between small blocks and big blocks, of course, there were accusations thrown in the other direction, basically saying that proponents of the big block side were actually coming in from other cryptocurrency communities trying to split apart or break or cause damage to the Bitcoin ecosystem. And so, like, I personally think that in both cases, those arguments actually ended up being overrated. I think in general, people tend to be too quick to blame things on foreigners, and tends to not appreciate enough the extent to which actual divergence of opinion exists even in their own communities. But even still, like there was this interesting fact that it was difficult to know for sure, right? The reason why it was difficult to know for sure is that all that people had is these Reddit accounts, and with a Reddit account, like no one knows if you participated in the Ethereum community a little bit, or you participated in a lot, or you're just one of 200 bots that's run by the same person that's just like trying to manipulate the results of a discussion in their preferred direction. And so this question of like, well, who should participate anyway, right? Like if we want to have this concept of like, well, here, these people are, and quote, real Bitcoin people or real Ethereum people, and these people are, quote, coming in from another community, like, what does that even mean? How do you even define that, right? And so there is this concept of membership of a community, right? So members in a community, there is a general idea that they should be participating in governance, or that they should have more say in governance in that community than non-members do. And then also outside experts can participate in governance, right? And this happens all the time. Companies hire consultants, governments have foreign advisors all the time. The Ethereum community is sometimes, or various organizations that temporarily hire cryptographers. There's always a need for experts, and including experts that are not also persistent members of the community. Though, of course, if an expert participates enough, they can also become a member. So one of the ways at kind of thinking through this, right, is that members of a community tends to be good at deciding what the ends are, kind of what the goals are that some mechanism is trying to achieve, but they're not necessarily good at deciding means, right? Like just random people in the community, especially if it's a widely distributed democratic vote, like they don't necessarily have all the correct ideas about like what are the best strategies to use to achieve some objective. And sometimes, as far as strategies go, like you actually want to have room for strategies that some small group of people are very confident work correctly, and where they only get proven right after the fact. And they sometimes need some kind of room to actually develop those strategies until they get proven right. Outside experts can be good at deciding the means given specific ends if they're held accountable, right? So to me, being held accountable basically means that they have some kind of reward, could be financial, could be psychological, could be social, could be all three. If the community, if their decisions lead to good outcomes, and they get some kind of penalty if their actions lead to bad outcomes. Now, means and ends are often hard to separate, and so sometimes, like, you even want people who are in both groups at the same time. So last week, I published this post with Optimism people on retroactive public goods funding. And the core idea here is to basically try to, it's essentially a decentralized prize fund for where prizes are given for things or projects that provide value to some community, where the prizes are given retroactively. So after the project has already achieved some good outcome. And the way that projects get funding before they can actually finish is projects can issue tokens. Anyone on the outside, hopefully people who know what's going on, can buy these projects tokens to bet on what will achieve the desired goals. And if they guess correctly, then then the project token gets a retroactive prize. And if they don't bet correctly, then the project token does not get a retroactive prize, and they ended up losing their money. So, and then the retroactive rewards are decided through some democratic mechanism, which could be quadratic funding or quadratic voting. It could be simple voting. It could be something else. Right, so this is basically kind of combining prediction market-like logic, and that's trying to target kind of goals and doesn't really care who participates, and this kind of democratic governance at the end that is actually trying to kind of implement the community's idea of what goals it's going toward. So who is a member of a community, right? This question is important, right? Like, you want Ethereum, like we have this intuitive notion in our heads that it's better for Ethereum people to have more say over Ethereum protocol decisions and Bitcoin people to have more say over Bitcoin protocol decisions than vice versa, or than both groups having an equal say in both. And often membership is non-binary. So there's this concept of to what extent someone is a member of a community. So for example, I'm a member of the Ethereum community. Lots of people here are members of the Ethereum community. Lots of people I interact with on Reddit or that are members of the Ethereum community. Just people who randomly recognize me on the street are members of the Ethereum community. But different people are members of the Ethereum community to a different degree, right? And we have existing attempts to formalize membership, and we have existing attempts to formalize membership and degree of membership of different kinds, right? So for example, there's citizenship in a country. Citizenship is binary, either you're a member or you're not. There is having an account. So for example, having an account in a forum or having an account on Reddit. That's binary, and that's a low threshold. Karma, like points on an internet forum, that's linear. So you can have accounts with no karma, accounts with low karma, accounts with high karma. Often internet forums even explicitly give like extra privileges that go up the higher the tier you get into. Coins and shares in companies, big BTC, ETH, governance tokens, also a concept of membership that reflects how much money you have invested in some project or ecosystem, and also a concept of membership. One of the ways in which you can compare these is you can put them on a graph between like basically level of commitment, what level of effort you put into a community, and level of recognition, meaning like what level of power the system assigns you as a result. And that could be formal governance power, or it could just be some kind of informal formal recognition in some kind of in discussion forums that informally leads to power. So forum accounts are this yellow line: low threshold, low recognition; citizenship, higher threshold, high recognition. Coins are just a line. You can have a few, you can have more, you can have even more. Karma on forums, you can have a little, you can have more, you can have even more. But each one of these has its flaws, right? So citizenship, for example, it can be exclusionary, it can be elitist. Also, if we go beyond countries and we start talking about internet communities, then it becomes harder to make a credibly neutral criterion for who is a citizen, right? Like with a country, you can say, oh, if you get into a country and you spend 10 years living there, you can be a citizen. And that seems like a formal rule that people can agree on. It seems reasonable, and it seems to give good results. But in an internet community, it's harder to do this, right? Having an account is another concept of membership. It's vulnerable to brigading. So people from one community that wants to influence another community, they just quickly create accounts, or they use their existing accounts if they're Reddit accounts, and they just kind of pop over and say things. Karma on internet forums only captures some types of contributions. It's also gameable. You can buy accounts, you can pay for upvotes, you can do lots of things. Coins also only capture some types of contributions. They capture contributions that get financial rewards. They often do not capture contributions to public goods or even contributions to things that cannot be easily financially rewarded, and also gameable. Coins are also vulnerable. They privilege subtypes of contributions over others. Coins do not do a good job of selecting for local expertise. So for example, if you have karma on an internet forum, that actually usually means that you spent a lot of time and effort putting yourself into that particular community. And as a byproduct, you know what you're talking about within the context of that community. Coins, it does mean you made a commitment. If you threw $1 million into Bitcoin, then you really like Bitcoin. But throwing $1 million into Bitcoin is not proof that you know a lot about Bitcoin. And also it's vulnerable to financialization. So it's vulnerable to these financial things where potentially once a financial system gets advanced enough, it basically starts separating out the governance power in a token from the economic interest in a token. And you can make this kind of gadget where you basically create a wrapper and people put the token into the wrapper, and then they get this wrapped thing that represents the economic interest, but then the governance power goes to someone else. And the governance power goes to the highest bidder, and this ends up favoring concentrated interests a lot. So my personal conclusion is that all of these are imperfect, and until we have things that are better, and probably even when we have things that are better, like I think a pluralist approach, like any kind of community, especially crypto and internet communities, but I think communities that are kind of rooted in things in offline space also need to think about this, but it's important to combine together multiple concepts of membership. So let's talk about having an account, right? So one of the 4 things that I have here is, as a concept of membership, they're just having an account, right? Just a simple account. And the goal is that you want something limited to 1 per person so that the curve actually looks like this, and you can't just keep on, creating more and more accounts. And the goal is, right, that we want to combine together multiple of these concepts of membership. And concepts of membership, they're not the same thing as proof of personhood, right? Proof of personhood is like very universalist. It just says, hey, if you're a human, then you get one. Concepts of membership are not that. You have to actually work and put effort into a community to get membership, at least if your concept of membership works well. But what I want to argue is that proofs of personhood are valuable even within these other constructions. So first of all, just having an account itself is useful, right? It's useful to have something that's low threshold where you still need a bit of effort, but that effort is only just the effort of caring enough to participate. Like that can be gamed, but that still delivers good results a lot of the time. So that, and it's very egalitarian, it's very inclusive, it's very easy to participate. It does require some form of proof of personhood to be secure. So there are already proofs of personhood that are insecure, right? So Reddit, Twitter, GitHub, most people only have one. And if you're lazy, then even if you want to screw around and do with some community and like participate in some way that's not aligned with their interests, then like most people, they would still be they would probably be too lazy to figure out how to get 100 accounts. But it is possible to get 100 accounts. It's possible to buy all these accounts. It's possible to buy thousands of them. But even still, often they work well enough, right? So a lot of discussions in the Ethereum community, for example, depends on GitHub accounts. There's kind of implicit polling that happens for a lot of EIPs, Ethereum improvement proposals, where basically someone makes a GitHub pull request that includes a proposal, and people just do a thumbs up or do a thumbs down, and people actually take those thumbs ups and thumbs down seriously as an indication of community sentiment. So that uses proof of personhood, but it's not very secure, and also it doesn't attempt to distinguish kind of to what extent you're actually a strong Ethereum contributor. Now, a more secure proof of personhood would solve one of those problems, right? A more secure proof of personhood would make it more difficult to actually brigade that kind of system and come in with and give yourself 1,000 accounts. Now, coins with sublinearity. So this is interesting, right? So this is where some of the ideas that I and Glenn and others have been working on with quadratic voting and quadratic funding come in. Basically, these are governance mechanisms that do use coins, right? And they basically say that you have to actually pay to participate in some decision. And the purpose of paying to participate in some decision, this time it's not like paying as membership directly, or it's not holding coins as membership, it's paying as a signal that you care about that decision. Now, paying as a signal that you care about a decision, if you just do it linearly, so if you say, if you pay $100, you have 100 times the impact of someone who pays $1, then it ends up favoring concentrated interests and wealthy people kind of way too much. But it turns out that there's a bunch of mathematical reasons why, if instead of taking the amount of money that someone pays, you take the square root of that amount, then you get something that actually does do a fairly decent job of balancing between being democratic and actually taking into account the fact that people have different strength of preferences. And strength of preference can indirectly measure strength of community membership, because if you're a more heavily involved member of a community, then you are likely to be more willing to actually like sacrifice more in order to influence some decision, right? So it's a different kind of membership of measurement of membership, but it still is that in some ways. So quadratic voting does this, quadratic funding does this, but the problem is, well, if you have a square root formula, then, well, the square root of 100 is 10, the square root of 1 is 1, and so if you have $100, then you make 100 fake accounts, and with each of your 100 fake accounts, you send in $1, and you get 100 votes instead of 10 votes. And proof of personhood prevents this kind of splitting attack, which is nice. Proofs of participation. So this is getting into other kinds of like attempts to measure membership that actually like that do try to provide different levels of gradation, but with within like one system, right? So the goal is to define membership in a community through proofs of having completed some activity. So karma is one example of this. Participation at events. So in Ethereum, there's this POPE protocol, the Proof of Attendance protocol, where a lot of events issue POPE tokens, and you can get a POPE token if you participate at an event. So these are good, and like lots of events issue POPE tokens, and if you have lots of POPE tokens, then that shows that you attended lots of events. And another example of this, this is something that Balaji Srinivasan really likes, is proofs of learning, right? So you can learn something through some kind of online course, and you can complete an exercise, and you can prove that you completed an exercise and got the result correctly. So you can say it's a special case of a proof of attendance protocol. Now, proof of personhood can help proofs of participation, right? So there's two reasons for this. One of them is this kind of sublinearity argument issue, right? Like basically, if your proof of participation is one where it's easy to get a little or a little bit, but it's much harder to get more. So like, for example, you need to participate 20 times longer to get 10 times more governance power, then you still have an incentive to create split personalities. And like basically, if you have 20 units of time, instead of spending them on one identity, you spend them on 20 different identities, and you get 20 units of governance power instead of 10. Proof of personhood can make it more difficult to create these split personalities. Also, for online events, you do not want it to be possible to like just show up at an online event with 20 virtual avatars and get 20 proof of attendance tokens instead of one, right? And so having a proof of personhood be a precondition for getting a POPE token if you participate at an event, like that also improves security there. So like these are just a bunch of ways in which to solve this problem of like who actually should participate in governance and to what extent. We do need to, like, first, we definitely have to look beyond coins, and we definitely have to look beyond just very simple, naive one per person things that have some fixed threshold. And there's a lot of different ideas for this, but even for those ideas, proof of personhood is just very useful as an ingredient in a lot of them. So where do we go from here, right? I think there's a few things that we can do. Like one is to make proof of personhood better. Two is to actually integrate proof of personhood into these other proof of X mechanisms. So like actually make a pope that's dependent on having a proof of personhood of some kind. And actually make quadratic funding depend on proofs of personhood. That's been happening. Gitcoin grants have been improving their Sybil protection for some time now. And just improve community discussion and governance in general, right? Like the ultimate goal of all of these things is to have better governance, and having better governance is not just about having governance, right? A lot of the time, the governance itself is only the last step, and discussion is something that's also very important, right? But even in a discussion, proof of personhood also can be important. Now, not always, right? Because sometimes like a good argument is a good argument regardless of who made it. But if someone is making a claim about like what their own values are, or if someone's making an appeal to personal experiences within some community, then like you want to know whether or not that person actually is either a new member of that community, or a very long-time member of a community, or a very highly contributing full-time member of that community, or someone else. Like that's important decision, important information to have in that step as well. But there's a lot of things that can be improved in addition to like figuring out these membership and these proof of personhood questions as well. So that's what I have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vitalik. I definitely want to hear your thoughts on some of Professor Margaret Levi's comments on this distinction between legitimacy in terms of coordination and legitimacy in terms of collective action.
Yes.
Before we get into that,
sure.
Sorry, I want to get back to the overall theme of our workshop and hear from you if you have any thoughts to share with us on what could possibly be some of the implications of proof of personhood networks for the current institutions that we have, and how could they improve existing problems that maybe are difficult to address within the institutional frameworks that we have today?
Sure. So I think second question first. I think one important thing to remember is that in 2021, like the concept of existing institutions realistically does involve internet communities. Now you can argue that crypto communities are still too niche to be considered, a part of the any kind of establishment, but there's many kinds of internet communities whose outcomes do end up mattering a lot, right? Like on like discussions on social media become very relevant for policy, for example, and social media, like they has this like all social media platforms have this hard trade-off between like basically being exclusive and being vulnerable to like brigading and civil attacks and similar things. And proof of personhood could be potentially like part of a solution to provide a best of both worlds in a way that's very, very inclusive to a lot of people anywhere. And there's plenty of other internet institutions as well. I mean, I don't know if like to what extent like Wikipedia has challenges, for example, but that's like anything in that category that needs some way of just preventing people from creating thousands of accounts is something that could use proof of personhood. And I think almost everything on the internet fits into that. Going outside of the internet, again, I think there, like, things become trickier because like, regardless of what you think of them, some forms of centralized identity do exist already. And so, like, you don't just have, like, you're not just or the trade-off that you're making is not proof of personhood versus like anyone being able to spin up 50,000 bots. The trade-off is proof of personhood versus you know, passports or phone numbers or whatever else. And that argument can be made sometimes, but it's a harder argument to make. I think the cases where that argument is the strongest are when you have something international, and when you have potentially some kind of like developing low income country where even the formal infrastructure is already missing a lot of people. And I think those two are probably the major ones. Another interesting one is if you're trying to do something where, like, you both want to ensure that you're talking to or getting information from real people, but at the same time, those real people want to protect their privacy, and including protecting your privacy from whatever institutions are giving them their identity. But the challenge there, right, is that, like, that's less a problem of like centralized ID versus decentralized ID. That's a problem of zero knowledge proofs. And zero knowledge proofs can be used with both, though zero knowledge proofs do combine with cryptographic implementations of proof of personhood, like, you know, proof of humanity on Ethereum pretty naturally. So there may be a fit there as well. On the first question, actually, this is what I wanted to ask Margaret. Like, what is an example of something that you would call a collective action problem that's not a coordination game? Like, I know they exist, but I was just wondering, like, what you're thinking about.
Well, as you know, Vitalik, the difference between the two is in a coordination problem, basically everybody has the same interest. I mean, the toy example, which is a real example, is driving on the left side or the right side of the road. In a collective action problem, there are people who want a free ride and who can still get the collective good even if they free ride. If you free ride on driving on the wrong or right side of the street, you're going to end up either killing or being killed, or both. And it's a very different kind of outcome. So governments deal a lot with collective action problems, and that's where coercion and other forms of producing compliance become an incredibly important part of the story. So they're not social conventions. You might try to turn them into coordination games, but it's very hard to do that. There are things where people really benefit from not participating, and you want to get beyond that. You want to find ways to get them to contribute.
Yeah. Okay. I think I definitely agree with that. I think it might even be just a difference of language more than anything else, right? Like, I think the way that I think about this is solving a collective action problem usually requires setting up an institution of some kind, and that institution does, in order for that institution to have teeth, people have to participate in it, right? And actually getting from here to there, like, I guess that's where I see a lot, like, that step I see as being a coordination game. So even like getting a law passed, for example, like if you do some work, then that work can often be wasted unless a lot of other people get that law, work with you to get the law passed at the same time. And just the process of setting up a government itself. But so I guess the way that I think of this is that there's ways of converting, or a lot of the ways of solving collective action problems do end up converting them into coordination games first.
Some, but not all. Maybe in the
Okay.
world of technology and the kinds of things you're talking about, that's possible. But in the world of tough politics that aren't about the internet, that's not always so easy to achieve. We can see that in the world that we're living in right now. The social norms and social conventions among different populations are really different. And so creating a common social norm, a common social convention, turning a collective action problem into a convention is not so easy. And that's the kind of politics that I deal with.
Would you disagree that following and enforcing the law is a social convention?
I would disagree.
Why? Like if the
Because a lot of
police
people
just
don't
decide-
follow the law.
Okay. Well,
I mean,
I
not
think
everybody buys into the norm. It's
That's true,
really
but I think,
different problem
nobody-
from a philosophical point of view and from a collective. Somebody, Christopher, asked about collective choice. And from the collective choice literature point of view, social conventions and coordination games and collective action games are really different problems.
And I think norms have lots of people that just don't care about them either. I know, and I get that there is a big difference. Like one of them, with coordination games, like once everyone flips over, it's stable. But with collective action games, like you have to create another game to make it stable.
And it's an ongoing iterative effort often, as opposed to, with a coordination game, usually once you set the rules, everybody goes along. You don't need an enforcement mechanism beyond the cost to you of if you violate it.
All right.
Okay,
this is a super interesting discussion. We have tons of incredible questions, so I just want to make space for them. Everyone, please raise your hands.
Can I make one other point though about that? Because the reason I'm emphasizing this is not simply because there is a technical distinction in game theory. That's interesting, but not so interesting. But that we have to really confront a world in which there is a lot of conflict, and collective action understands that. Coordination does not. I mean, it recognizes.
I think this is actually a perfect point for us to bring in Brian Ford's question. I'll read. Brian, can you please ask it out loud, and then everyone can just raise your hands and we'll follow that.
Yeah. Well, so super interesting talks, both of you. Thank you. I wanted to ask both of you actually about, you both touched a lot on this question of membership and representativeness and legitimacy. Can you discuss why communities want to or need to create clearer distinctions between members and non-members, the inside, the outside, and the trade-off between that and the risk of, say, gradually becoming more insular, more ossified, more inward focused, kind of rewarding the existing members instead of bringing in more members and growing. And so one way I like to think of this is, as a community decision, maybe you have to make the choice between serving your existing members and having a governance structure that represents your existing members, or are you trying to create a structure that represents the potentially much larger membership, the population that you don't have as members yet, but would like to, right? And so
I think that's a great question, Brian. And so it made me think about this issue in a slightly different way, actually, than I've been thinking about it. So when I'm talking about an expanded community of faith, an inclusive community of faith, I think what I'm really talking about has a lot to do with who you will mobilize on behalf of, who you will act
the distant other
for.
you talked about.
It can be a distant other, it can be a stranger. So think about the environmental movement, particularly that led by young people. It's really a big community of faith where people don't have membership per se, but they recognize that they're part of the same human or human nature community. Another kind of community is really what I think Vitalik was describing beautifully, is where there's, and where that Federica was talking about in the Council of Algorithms, which is really about a community with members in it, where you've assigned roles or participation status or rights to vote or power in some way, and there are boundaries to it. So even in my case of the unions, in their expanded and inclusive community of faith, they had both kinds of communities. So they had their membership in the organization, which had all kinds of boundaries and exclusivities involved in it, and various kinds of roles within the organization. But they also had this expanded notion of community, which extended to others who would never be members of their particular community. And I think we really want to play with both levels of that. The danger of the membership community you have identified well is that it tends, and even of an expanded community of faith, it's actually a term that got used by the Nazis to talk about an inclusive and a very exclusive community of people. So all of those cases, we really have to constantly be fighting with and finding the right institutions and the right governance arrangements to inhibit that tendency for people to really identify in an exclusive and inhibiting way to others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I agree. There's like tough trade-offs to make. I do think though that like it's not a kind of like 180 degree against each other insurmountable trade-off, because well, one of the things is that recognizing the existence of existing members and that their voice means more than the voice of someone who has not yet contributed anything does not, like, recognizing that existing facts does not imply being again or not having other processes that try to be maximally inclusive in helping new people join, right? So I think you can have both. I do think that ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to recognize some concept of membership somehow. I mean, Eleanor Ostrom, I think, in governing the commons, like this is even one of her criteria, right? That you need to have a clear distinction of like what the inside and the outside is. Now, the question of like, can you create a governance mechanism that formally represents, I guess, like your goal of helping other people get included into that mechanism is interesting. But I guess the question to ask that, like, and it's an amazing goal. I really support it. But the question there is like, what mechanism actually represents the interests of those people, right? And
that's hard to do. I agree.
Yeah, it is hard to do, and like, how do you distinguish someone like the will of someone who is interested in participating versus like the will of someone who really is just interested in like screwing around and not interested in contributing genuinely? I don't know. I mean, my answer to this stuff is fairly like experimentalist. Like, let's just try a lot of things and like analyze them and see what happens.
All right.
I just want to add one thing, if I can, Paula. Can I add one thing?
Go for it. Go for it.
I totally agree with that, and I'm a big fan of the Ostrom principles. But I also think that there's another issue that Brian's raising that we just can't lose sight of. And this really comes from social psychological work. I mean, some of you are probably familiar with the Tajfel experiments and things that have emerged from that, where if you just assign somebody Vitalik's a blue and Paula's a red, the next thing you know is we've formed exclusive communities of reds and blues who compete with each other rather than cooperate with each other. So, you know, writing into these notions of community and of governance, the recognition that that is a tendency and a tension is, I think, critical. And I thought that was part of what Brian's question was really getting at.
Yeah, I agree. That's a great point, Margaret. I think one of the things that I usually stress that where I think part of the goal is avoiding that tendency is this idea that membership is a spectrum and not a binary. And like you can be a red, you can be a lot very red and a little bit of a blue, or you can be medium red and medium blue, and like you can have all the shades of purple and add a little green as well. And I think like real human communities do work that way, and we should totally celebrate and explicitly recognize that.
Yeah, well, I think that what's interesting about proof of personhood networks is that precisely we're talking about something that is even below or above that, which is just, the other in terms of proof of personhood networks are the bots or attackers to the system, but this is not necessarily creating any specific community among legitimate humans. But it's an interesting discussion because, of course, the way that we go about determining proof of personhood might end up leading to these types of segregation in communities. But I'll let Primavera come in now, and everyone, please feel free to respond to her question. If you have any point, just please keep raising your hands. Primavera.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. So I just wanted to actually follow up on Brian's question and kind of like expanding on a slightly different direction, because I think that indeed, so Brian, you're raising this important question about like how do we ensure inclusivity and how do we allow more and more people to become members? To me, the problem with that vision, while I agree with that, I think that's a very important thing to think about. But it also somehow lead this focus towards the idea that the more voice and the more influence should be given to the people that are the more strong contributors from the spectrum of membership. And so in some way, it means that if I want to have a voice, I need to contribute, and I need to contribute according to whatever metrics have been established by the community to qualify me as a contributor, which makes sense. But at the same time, I think there is another gap that emerged, which is the fact that some people might actually not have the opportunity and maybe not want to contribute, and yet they are inherently affected by the decision that the community will make. And so to me, it seems that when we're designing this type of like protocol about how to give influence to people, on the one hand, it's important to account about how much they have been contributing to the community, but at the same time, there might be another metrics that also need to be accounted for, which is giving the voice depending on the degree to which a particular individual is actually affected. And this is like oftentimes the people that are affected by decision are not necessarily members of the community making the decision. And of course, this is really hard to, how do you metrify, how do you quantify the impact that a decision has on a person, and how do you give voice to this person? But to me, we cannot expect that everyone that is affected by a decision needs to be a hardcore contributor in order to acquire the possibility of voice him or herself.
Right. That's yeah, and I think a good point. I guess there's two ways. For me, there's two ways of looking at that. One way of looking at it is that like membership in a community can be not just a function of what effort you put in, but also a function of to what extent you're affected by a decision. Even just like one example of this is like in a lot of places, like in local elections, for example, like if you live in some place, then you can vote for local politics there, and that's not tied to any notion of contributing to that city. That's just like, well, you live there, and so you're affected by the decisions, right? And you can base membership on that. The other way of looking at it is that sometimes like actions that communities or actions that infrastructure managed by communities takes really can have like externalities, positive or negative, that stretch out across the entire world. And like I think ultimately every community does have some degree of responsibility to do what it can to make sure those externalities are positive as much as possible and negative as little as possible. And some, like, it would be ideal to have some kind of like voice in governance for that as well, but how to actually do that and how to also just encourage communities to have that at all, like that, and those are also hard problems.
Let me add something to that, because what you've just described, Primavera, is really government everywhere. Federal, national governments, local governments, as Vitalik was saying, where in fact we are citizens who are affected but don't necessarily participate. There are a lot of us like that. And so part of the response to that is, I mean, if we're talking about membership, yes, I think people who are affected should be members. But in terms of participation, one of the big problems here is that people don't always have the capabilities to participate. They don't know they can, they don't know how to, they don't understand the issues. And this goes back to the relational equality argument I was making, which is really about enhancing those capabilities so that more people can, who choose to, not everyone will choose to be an active member, even if something affects them. But those who would like to be can actually act on that, can actually make their membership meaningful.
So I'll just do a quick question before we go towards Peter. You know, this is a common issue within blockchain networks because, of course, we have a bit of a rule of the experts, who are the people who really understand the technical aspects of these protocols, which hinders participation from the public at large. So I'm interested in understanding what is, do you think, the role for these experts to have within these communities? Do you think that there should be more of an emphasis on educational components? Should everyone be learning how to code? Or how can we deal with that asymmetry of information within these types of deeply technical communities? It's a question for both of you.
Sure. So I guess like I personally definitely deeply believe in education and in like educating in ways that's accessible to people from a wider variety of backgrounds. And one of the things I do is I have my blog, and I use that to describe a lot of this like fairly complicated technical and cryptography ideas. And like I know that those things are not going to be understandable by 100% of the population, but like, you know, 10% is better than 1% and 1% is better than 0.1%, because if there is a proposal that's being made that has problems, then like even if it's only a few people, the more people that can critique, the greater the chance that something that specific that deserves to be critiqued actually will be critiqued in a way that's visible to more people. So that, I think, education is a big part of even just decentralization to me. Like one of the things I say, and this is, I mean, you do need to have a bit of a crypto background to understand the word, but a cryptographic protocol that only 20 people understand is just another kind of trusted setup. So that's so that's definitely big. Aside from that, I guess the other kind of solution is like what I call accountability, and like basically engaging experts in ways that like when you see what results the outcome of their work leads to, like that actually kind of comes back and has consequences to them, and like either just to them as a reward, or to or a penalty, or to them just as an influence to like what level of participation they'll be able to have in the future.
Margaret, do you have any comments on that?
I would just emphasize, I mean, I think expertise is never going to be spread equally around. I mean, I'm trying desperately, as I said, to understand blockchain, and I may never It's not playing to my strengths. But I respect those who have that expertise and can use it in all the productive ways that people here are using it. So then the really critical question is what Vitalik is calling accountability. And I think what he's describing as ways to ensure accountability are one of the mechanisms for doing that. But I think there are others that we should also attend to. And this is why I sort of had problems answering some of the questions, and I'm not of the school that you do away with all existing institutions. I think that one of the things that we've learned through the experiment of liberal democracy is that representative government has its place. Now, we're not doing it particularly well, but that doesn't mean it can't be improved. And through representative government, we have mechanisms of accountability of people who can watch the people who are the technical experts and make sure that they're acting according to the public good or the desired end. So I think their accountability is the key, and there are a variety of forms of accountability.
You know, I agree that having democratic votes is definitely a form of accountability that's worked quite well in a lot of cases.
All right, Peter. Can you ask your
Thanks,
question?
Paula. My question aligns with the active membership and accountability theme raised by Primavera. With blockchain, we are switching from using force to using motivation to make things work. Because of this, I think identity score will basically mean credit score in the long run. And so the higher the score, the more you can get. So the questions are, do you think this is where we go? If so, is this fine, or should we avoid it? And more general, what is the difference between reputation and uniqueness?
I think this is definitely one of those complicated topics. Like, you know, what actually is like what are the negative things that people are kind of are afraid of when they're instinctively afraid of, like things like social credit scores, or like FICA credit scores being expanded to everything, or and similar kinds of things, right? I think there are legitimate concerns, but like it's that are really important, but it's important to or if we want to figure out what actually makes sense at some points, like we have to actually have this much deeper public conversation about kind of articulating those downsides beyond just kind of like vaguely pointing a finger at the word dystopia. And that's something I think that like we as a civilization haven't really done enough and should do more. I would say, like some obvious disadvantages that come to mind. Like one is that there's often in those existing kinds of things, there's like single centralized actors that have a lot of influence over that score, and they have the ability to incorporate just basically their own prejudices into that score, like either their own political opinions or like their own ideas about personal morality that actually don't have anything to do with with the goal of being trustworthy. Another issue that often comes up is just infringement of privacy. And on two ways, right? Like having to provide your score can infringe your privacy. And also there's a privacy concern in that, like there's certain types of like people should be able to have conversations freely and be able to speak their minds. And for that to be possible, like you don't want every single word you say to possibly be an input into a magic algorithm. So I think a lot of those things can be I think it is possible to come up with something that resolves those concerns, but like this is one of like the output may not necessarily even look like a number, right? This is one of those things that's important. Like I think the concept of a credit score as it exists in modern culture is like basically says like, hey, you know, you have a number and everyone sees the same number, and that's not even necessarily true. And one of the reasons why that's not necessarily true is because different people in different communities and different contexts have different expectations and different needs about what kinds of credit or trustworthiness or whatever else they care about. Like one person might, really care whether or not you're compliant with Sharia law. Another person just wants to know whether or not you're going to pay your debts. A third person might care about something else entirely. And so, like one number cannot satisfy everyone. So I think that's a really important just example of a direction to look into. So yeah, I don't know what the reputation ecosystems of the future will look like, but this is the sort of thing that's probably going to take dozens of hours dozens of years to figure out, and not dozens of minutes.
Thanks. I'll guess.
Primavera made
we'll
an interesting. Sorry, go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, just wanted to note that Philip also put it in the chat that non-local, non-contextual reputation is evil, and this goes along with what Vitalik says. One number is evil, and totally agree with that. With decentralized systems, we can make multiple numbers. So probably a decentralized credit score is not evil. Thanks.
Yeah, everyone, feel free to jump in. These are not only questions for Professor Margaret and Vitalik. We should all be participating. So Ted or Professor Margaret, do you have any response to that? No?
Hey, I had a question for Professor Margaret, actually. So you mentioned unions coming together and for narrow interests, and then later coming to serve sort of the public benefit or strangers at a distance. And you mentioned this was brought about by the actions of the union, the institution. And I was curious what sorts of actions you observed leading to a broadening of a broadening support for distant strangers in the hopes, because in the crypto space, we have a lot of people coming together for narrow financial interests. And so if that can be broadened out, that's wonderful. So I'm just wondering what the main mechanisms you saw at work there were.
Well, the main mechanisms really had to do with the governance arrangements of the union. Different unions have in principle, they're all democratic, but in fact, the rules are very different for different unions. So in the longshore unions, these were all unions in the transit sector that we were looking at. But the longshore unions that were particularly, that engaged in this expanded community of fate behavior were ones whose, when they were established, they set up rules that made sure that the president and the other major elected officials were subject to easy recall and lots of accountability. There was a lot of participatory democracy mechanisms put into place. The votes on things like the contracts that were negotiated with the employers were done by each individual, not by some representative, as in the Teamsters organization. Most important for the purposes of expanding the community of faith, there was lots of education and socialization about the rest of the world within the union. And when someone suggested an action like closing the ports that would be very costly and might even bring the police down, and heads get cracked and people go to jail and maybe even die certainly lose income for engaging in that action. The way those decisions were made the suggestion could be from the bottom or it could be from the top about this was an action to undertake. But the process of deciding whether to undertake the action involved debate and deliberation among the members in ways that allowed them to challenge the information. So for example, one pensioner from the Longshore Union in Australia told us about how he was at a meeting and he was told that those ships over there in the Sydney port were going to Indonesia and they were Dutch ships in order to put down the peasant rebellion there. He didn't know anything about the peasant rebellion, but he didn't think that was fair. And they debated it and made sure that that's really what the ships were doing, that there really was a rebellion of the Indonesians against the Dutch. And then they decided not to load the ships. And for years, they refused to load ships with armaments going to Indonesia. And it lost them money, it threatened their jobs, and yet they did that. So it was a set of participatory governance arrangements, a process of socialization, and a capacity to really debate and challenge the information that was presented, whatever the source.
Great, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Just a quick note here. We have come to the official end of our discussion, but everyone is welcome to stay for another half hour so that we can continue this exciting debate.
I'm afraid I must leave. Thank you so much.
Fortunately,
Thank you so much.
have to leave
Margaret,
as well.
is there?
So,
Do we have your contact info?
You should. It's
Okay.
easy, mlevi@stanford.edu, or my name with a period in between at gmail.com. And it's spelled Levi,
Thank you.
but pronounced Levy. Thank you. And call me Margaret.
you so
Don't call me
much.
Professor Margaret, Paula.
All
Thank
right.
you very
Thank
much.
you so much for being with us, Margaret. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much, Vitalik.
okay,
And
thank you.
Thank you
for
so much.
everybody else, if you want to stay, you're welcome to. All right, Adam, you go next.
Thanks. So yeah, I asked my question in the chat already, but I'm just curious what scenarios there might be, if we can even dream up scenarios where there might be, like we can sort of objectively say that people value their votes equally, because if we had, let's say, a non-universal system or non-universal group of people that were voting or deciding on something, and everyone had approximately the same value, attributed the same value to their vote, then that just immediately takes bribery out of the way. So in as much as we can dream up a scenario like that, I think it's interesting to think about that. So I wonder, because to me, that's like, we talk about the anti-Sybil, but like something that I got from I already kind of knew this, but from when Brian Ford was in Glenn Weil and that panel was going on, that they basically said, hey, they're, for any of this stuff that's not universal, it's going to fail because someone's going to come out from outside and just the bribery is going to overpower everything. So anyways, I'm curious about this. And I want to know if this is really hard. So, but I just want to know if anyone has already thought about this.
Ted is actually doing some work on this, so maybe you can talk a little bit about it, Ted.
Sorry, I was actually distracted for a moment, and so I was calling up to try and find the question.
I can
was
say
talking about the problems with vote buying, bribery. So I just thought that this would be a good opportunity for you to mention the work that you're doing. Of course, one of the goals here is to facilitate collaboration. So just thought about bringing it up.
So vote buying, there might be really pernicious problem. I've been looking into ways that we can maybe encourage the person whose vote is being bought to defect on the person who's buying their vote in a way where the defector actually earns extra money and the person who paid for the vote doesn't ever find out that it happened. So there might be a way to, I saw your idea in chat of making it so that coming to a world where everybody has, everybody's vote is of equal import to them. And that would be a really wonderful world. I would love to live in that world, but it feels quite far away. So in the meantime, we might need to invent something else. And I know probably Brian Ford has thought about this as well, and probably a bunch of other people here.
So how would where does that extra money come from? So you talk about giving a reward that's bigger than what someone bribing might be willing to do. Where would that? Well, how do you how do you arrive at something that's bigger than what someone would be willing to pay in a bribe?
I feel like Christopher Allen has an interesting perspective on this.
Well, I mean, it's a couple of different things. I mean, you have to look at existing systems. I mean, part of the reason why you have voting curtains and things of that nature was to be able to prove that in that particular space, that nobody can observe you, that nobody can coerce you, et cetera, into abiding rather than basically going, well, he may have paid me $50 to vote his way, but screw him, I'm going to vote my way in this box, and he'll never know. So that, that exists now in voting systems, but trying to bring that into the virtual world is really hard. How to observe coercion, much less UX issues of telling people, hey, you're allowed to do what you want here. You're allowed to, nobody can see you, nobody can observe you, whatever. So if you want to not abide by some coercive thing, you don't have to here. So it's, it's a combination of both of those.
Yeah, I'm really skeptical of that because of things like trusted hardware setups. But so that's why I was asking this alternative question, like, is there a scenario where just the economics of it precludes any sort of bribery? Sorry, I think Brian was about to say something.
Yeah. So this is a super hard, hard and important question. And I think, both Ted and Christopher's answers are right on point. So one of the things to point out is in the voting systems, especially e-voting literature, there are a couple well-known approaches to coercion resistant schemes. One is the re-voting mechanism that Estonia implements. The other that's really only in the academic literature is Ted, it sounds like along somewhat similar lines that you're getting to, the JCJ, so-called JCJ scheme named after Jules, who are his colleagues, Jules Catalano and Jacobson, or something like that. Just look up JCJ e-voting in Google Scholar, you'll find it. That class of schemes, the basic idea is to give people give voters somehow both real and fake credentials. And the fake credentials are indistinguishable from real credentials to anyone, who isn't the voter, And the point is, if somebody is offering to buy your credentials or wanting to buy your vote, you sell them fake credentials, you make money, whatever they're willing to give you for them. And so, that kind of answers your question. Well, the money doesn't come from anywhere. The money comes from whatever sucker is willing to give you money for fake credentials, right? So it doesn't have to be created by anyone per se, but there could be alternate solutions to that. Now, the big catch, coming back to Christopher's point, is that nobody that I am aware of has proposed a JCJ type scheme that arguably successfully does this without either A, trusted hardware, which I don't like any more than you do, or B, an in-person moment where somehow somewhere real users can have that privacy booth or something equivalent, like Christopher was talking about. And that's actually the basis of what some of our research is currently looking in, trying to merge that kind of coercion resistance with a proof of personhood. But that only works with the in-person proof of personhood, of course. Go ahead, Chris.
Another thing from the real world in that category is notary. The non-US notaries have to basically not only assert did the two people sign it, but they weren't coerced. So Americans may not be familiar with that because that isn't in the US system. But but again, are there possible proofs for non-coercion?
Yeah, that's important.
Right, I just linked in chat an ETH research post by Vitalik, which you may already be familiar with, but if not, you might find it interesting.
So I wanted to bring up, I've had my hand up for a while and I've got to be going pretty soon.
Yes, please come in.
Thank you. One of my main things right now is, that after we meet this this summer, I feel like, trying to solve some of these problems when we don't actually know what the problems are is getting in our way. And I would really love to dive in deeply into what are all the metrics for fairness, what are the attacks and adversary motivations and things of that nature that we can then create a rubric to evaluate some of these different types of things or separate them into different categories. I mean, I'm fairly convinced that there is no right answer. It'll be different for every context, whether or not it's a global context or, it's the 10 of us in this room right now. And all of those will have different things, but I can't prove that statement. But like Arrow's impossibility theorem, which has a list, and when you go through that list, you discover some of them are in conflict. I'd love to have that, post this series of intros.
I think that maybe we could start this out just by people could, just so we have an idea of kind of the map of interest, maybe people could add to their own Notion bios what are things that they're interested in working on. And then maybe based on that, we can start seeing if we can create a couple working groups. What do you think? Does that sound good? All right. So I'll take care of that and ping everyone. Does anyone else has any comments to make? Peter, please.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add on the bribery thing. So if someone is not familiar with price of forgery of Upala, this is what we do. So in Upala, bribery doesn't differ from forgery. So actually we can measure bribery cost instead of fighting bribery. So this is what we do. If anyone's curious, I'd be happy to introduce you to the concept. And I'll share the ETH research link in the chat. Thank you.
Wonderful. Please also make sure to add it to your bio.
Oh, sure.
On
Sure.
Notion,
Thanks.
just so we have it there. And of course, we'll be writing a summary of this discussion as much as it's possible to summarize it, and we'll make sure to be adding.
Was there something from last week that got posted?
Yes, I sent it over email. Did you
I
get?
must have missed it.
Okay, all right, everyone. So a final note for us, for those of you who are here. Next week, we're having a really exciting presentation from Philip Sheldrick. It's also going to be an interesting and extremely enriching discussion for everyone. In order to prepare for it, I want to ask all of you, please, please, please go through the police exercise so that we can start it off already having some information in our hands. So I'll just share the link with you. I'll share it over again over email. But last week we were not so good at doing this group exercise, and so we had to take some time from our meeting here. I don't want to.
Will it be a new list of questions?
It's one question, and you just have to add statements, and then.
But I mean, are we going to be reusing the old? Like, I would completely redo my questions that I added before, given what's in there now. There were a lot of. I don't know. I mean, I just don't know if there's a restart is worthy.
That's a valid point. So actually, the idea, our final workshop is happening on the 30th of August. And so we're going to have a 1 week break. And then during that 1 week break, we're sending over quick summaries of our discussions, but we want to refine and elaborate this report a bit more. And this will also be an opportunity to elaborate a bit more on the reports of the police exercises. I'm sharing this because if you all have any additional statements to make, please keep adding them. And then in that 1 week break is the moment where we can all go back and vote on each other's statements so that we can refine it, the result from police even a bit more. But it's interesting that we have a snapshot of before discussions, and then we'll have a different snapshot from after discussion. So we'll have an interesting comparison to make. And then, no, Christopher, now it's going to be a new question that I'll be sending over right now for you. But you can add to the old question as well. So let me get you the link for the new question right now. And if you can, please add a couple statements, and then one day before we meet again next week, please make sure to vote on everybody else's statements. Here it is. All right, everyone, this was fascinating. Thank you so much for being here. You're the greatest group, and I'm extremely pleased to see everyone talking and just creating a room for some of these discussions. It's a dream come true to have this space. Thank you.
Greatest chair. Thank you.
Thanks for organizing.
Take care. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
We need to make sure, Vinay, to download the chat. Because I
Yeah.
think the last time we didn't get that.
No, we have it. It's
have it?
Dropbox.
Oh, okay, perfect. I just saved it now. Okay.